Okay, so I want to start again by dedicating the learning tonight to the neshama of my ima, Yehudit bat Dora v'Shaul, who passed away tonight, right after the fast day that we are fasting right now. So we are in Parshat Pinchas, and we're going to concentrate on one Rashi that many people don't even notice so much, and that is, for those who are following in a open Chumash, it's in chapter 27, the 18th verse, 27:18. Now, the parsha is Pinchas, and as we're going to see in the upcoming parshas, a transition is happening, that we are at the end of the 40 years in the desert, and the last few parshas of the book of Numbers records the transition that's happening. Moshe is not going to lead the people into the land. Yoshua is going to lead the people into the land. And the tribes take on a bigger importance, the princes of the tribes, because Moshe will not be there. And so in the 18th verse, it says, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. God said to Moshe, Kach lecha et Yehoshua bin Nun, Ish asher ruach bo, take for yourself Yehoshua bin Nun, a man who has spirit within him, v'samachta et yadecha alav, and you shall place your hand upon him. Now, first of all, what does it mean that Yeshua had spirit in him? So Rashi explains that Yoshua had the ability to connect to the spirit of each and every person as a unique connection, a unique communication. He was in tune with the spirit of each person. And what is this idea? Put your hand on him. So this is the same procedure that happens with an offering. At the time of the temple, when a person brought an offering, they had to lay their hands on if it was an animal, on the head of the animal, in order, in a sense, to make a deep connection, so that the animal, in a sense, is as if the person is offering a part of themselves. And this procedure is called smicha. And that's why the verb here is v'samachta et yadecha alav. You should put your hand upon him. A few verses later, in Pasuk Chaf Gimel 23, so it says, Vayismoch et yadav alav v'itzavehu kasher diber Hashem biyad Moshe. And then a few sentences later, it says that Moshe put his hands in the plural upon him, Yoshua, and he commanded him like God had told Moshe. So one might miss this completely, but Rashi points out God originally says, put your hand in the singular. And here it says he put both of his hands. So Rashi comments on that. This is a typical thing that Rashi is going to look to explain. Any variance in the text needs explanation. So he says like this. I'm just going to like paraphrase Rashi, that Moshe did this with a good eye. Now, in a different Rashi, it explains that Moshe actually wanted his son to take over for him. But God chose differently and chose Yehoshua. So you might think that Moshe is upset, Moshe's jealous of Yehoshua, maybe he's frustrated, maybe he's a little bit frustrated with God that his choice wasn't chosen. But here he says when he put both of his hands, he did it with a good eye. In other words, God had decided Yehoshua would take over, and that's what it is. There was no upset, there was no frustration, there was no anger. And when he transferred his power, and Yehoshua points out that this whole idea, what's called smicha, is handing over not only your rulership, your power, but transferring your inner being, your wisdom, and your, Rashi says, the text says your glory, your spirit. So it's actually a very, very moving ceremony to put your hands on your student and transfer your wisdom. So Rashi says that Moshe did it with a good eye, and he did it more than he was commanded, because God commanded him to put his hand, and Moshe, by his own initiative, took both of his hands and laid it on Yehoshua as a sign of his true wanting to give over everything to Yehoshua, and that Yehoshua should succeed. So when I read this Rashi, a flow of thoughts came to me, which I'd like to try to give over tonight. Because here Rashi is going out of his way to say that Moshe took initiative here. He went beyond God's command. And what I want to explain tonight is we actually see this with Moshe throughout his whole life. And we'll call it surprising or even paradoxical, Moshe is described as the most humble person on the face of the earth. And he is described as the Eved Hashem, and the most faithful in all of the house of God. He is the faithful servant of God. And we see for 40 years that Moshe does his absolute best to do everything that God commands him. He's a vessel, a clear vessel for not only God's Torah, but God's commands. He's ruling Israel according to God's command. So on the surface, it may seem a little surprising how many times Moshe takes initiative and makes decisions on his own. So that's what we're going to look at tonight. So if we go back, and I have to do this fairly quickly because we have a limited amount of time, is the first thing we see about Moshe is it says he goes out among his brethren and he sees an Egyptian beating a Jew, and he takes initiative and he actually kills the Egyptian. He saved the Jew's life. The Egyptian was actually beating him to death. So he saves a Jew, and in the process, he has to flee Egypt. He is we'll call him the Prince of Egypt, and with all the privilege that goes along with it. But when word gets back to Pharaoh, he has to flee. So Moshe gives up everything to save another Jew who's actually a stranger. But the point here is God didn't command him to do this. He did it on his own initiative. The next thing we see is Moshe ends up at a well in Midian, and the daughters of Yitro are being harassed. And Moshe gets up and he saves them from all of these harassing shepherds. And again, he takes complete initiative. For the next 40 years, according to one midrash, he is the shepherd of Yitro, which seems a fairly passive role to be in for 40 years. And then comes the burning bush. And here we would think, this is Moshe's chance. God is telling him to be the leader. And now he could really be the faithful servant. But what happens? Moshe argues with God for a week, a whole week. It's one of the longest dialogues that happens in the entire Bible. And he has an answer for everything that God says. Doesn't sound exactly like a faithful servant. Now, Moshe is doing this out of great humbleness because he truly doesn't feel that he has the qualifications, that he merits to be the leader. But here, my point is that Moshe doesn't say, okay, you want me to be the leader, just tell me what to do. He has a mind of his own. He has a voice of his own, and he expresses himself. Now, after a week, he accepts the position. He goes back to Egypt. He goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And what does Pharaoh do? He doubles the work. He says, I don't accept your God. I don't recognize him. And you're making the people not do their work. He doubles their work. So when Moshe comes out, again, it's a little bit surprising. He says, God, why have you done evil to this people? And why did you send me? From the time that you sent me, things have gotten worse. So here again, we see Moshe willing to speak his mind. He's not a mindless servant. He doesn't understand what's going on here. So he questions God. Now we see that Abraham does the same thing when he's trying to negotiate saving the city of Sodom, where Avram says, I am dust and ash. But at the same time, he says, will the God of justice not do righteously? How can you wipe out everyone? Maybe there are righteous people there. So here again, we see Avram also speaking his mind. Now, both of them, of course, it's not a sign of faith, lack of faith. It's a sign that they really believe that God is a just God, but they don't understand what are God's motives here. And they're asking. And you don't see that God says, no, how can you ask me? How can you challenge me? God doesn't. And we'll get back to that. We'll get to back why that is. Then we see, like in all of these cases, there's something very positive about it. But now we see that Moshe takes initiative when he decides to take out the mixed multitude from, one second.
This is later for the end of the class.
I did, Rachel. I said 27 years ago.
Oh, okay, I didn't catch that, okay.
Okay. My wife was afraid that I gave the impression that when I said my mother, Aleha Shalom, passed away tonight, she didn't hear when I said 27 years ago. Anyways, so Moshe takes out what are called the mixed multitude. The mixed multitude, they are the ones that Joseph had circumcised. Joseph wanted to fix the world. He is running the world. And people are coming to him for food. And Joseph sees a golden opportunity to begin a process that would fix the world. So he begins by circumcising certain of the people in Egypt in the hope that it would lead to much better spiritual occurrences. And when Israel was about to come out of Egypt, the mixed multitude asked, can we come too? They had a certain connection to the Jewish people. They had a certain connection that there was something beyond what was going on in Egypt. But according to tradition, God said to Moshe, I understand your motivation, but they're not ready. I'm telling you, do not take them. They're not ready. They're going to cause a lot of problems. And Moshe took them anyways. So this was an initiative that God allowed him to do, but it turned out pretty disastrous, as according to tradition, they were the main impetus in making the golden calf and in a number of the other great complaints that they had against God and Moshe, and caused a lot of problems in the desert. So here we see a case, one of the most important cases of Moshe taking initiative, but it did not turn out well. But here we see Moshe is a human being, and God allows free choice. And so here he allowed Moshe to take out the mixed multitude. But as I said, it did not end well. And in fact, according to the Kabbalah, the Zohar says the soul of Moshe is in every generation. The soul of Moshe reincarnates into the leaders of every generation, or parts of the soul of Moshe. And one of the explanations is that his taking the mixed multitude was really a huge mistake, and that the soul of Moshe has to come back in every generation in an attempt to fix that. So now we'll go on with other initiatives that Moshe took. And one is giving the Torah. We commemorate Shavuos on the 6th of Sivan. And yet there is a major discussion in the Gemara that when the Torah was it given on the 6th of Sivan or the 7th? Why would they say the 7th? So according to many opinions, and it's pretty much the accepted opinion, that Moshe on his own dot and his own initiative added an extra day, because God said, let the people prepare for 3 days, and on the 3rd day I will come and reveal myself and give the 10 commandments. And Moshe, from his own initiative, decided that when God came to Moshe, it was in the middle of the day. And so Moshe wanted it to be 3 days of preparation, 3 whole days of preparation. So he added an additional day. And God acceded to it. He accepted it. And so according to most opinions, Rashi holds this, is that in the year that the Torah was given, it was actually the 7th of Sivan. And here you see that God went along with a total initiative from Moshe. So there's actually an expression in the Gemara that a tzaddik decrees and God fulfills. Now, obviously, we would accept the statement to be the exact opposite, that God decrees and the righteous one fulfills it. But the sages say just the opposite. The power of a tzaddik is he can decree and God will fulfill. So here we see it, actually, the giving of the Torah, that it was Moshe's initiative to add an extra day. Now we come to another one, which is a huge one, and that's when on this day, the 17th of Tammuz, Moshe came down with the 2 tablets of the law. And we've discussed this, especially in the Tuesday class. And I know many of you attend the Tuesday class as well, that this day was supposed to be the greatest day since creation. Moshe Rabbeinu is coming down with the 2 tablets of the law. And we were to accept it and start our journey, our trek into Eretz Yisrael with Moshe. But it turned out very different with the golden calf. So when Moshe comes down and he sees the golden calf, God did not command him to break the tablets. Doesn't say that whatsoever. But Moshe, on his own initiative, breaks the tablets. Later in the Torah, when Moshe is describing the events at Sinai, and God is reminding Moshe and the people of the tablets, Asher Shibarta, that you broke. So the sages say, don't read it Asher Shibarta, read it Yesher Kochacha Asher Shibarta. Good work, Moshe, that you broke the tablets. But here again, we see God did not command Moshe to break the tablets. Moshe did it on his own initiative. And many, many, many ideas are given why he decided to do such a drastic thing. And one of them is from the Slonim Rabbi. The Slonim Rabbi says that when Moshe saw not just that they were worshiping the golden calf, they were dancing around the golden calf. And Moshe understood that unless he does something so drastic, the people would never do tshuva. And so by breaking the tablets, he shocked them out of their kind of like trance. And he paved the way for them to realize that what they had just done was terribly wrong. But as long as they were dancing around it, there was no way they could see that they were doing wrong. But there are many, many other reasons given. But the important thing here is this was a very important decision that Moshe made on his own to break the tablets. And then we'll go this through two more very, very quickly. And we discussed this already, sending the spies. Because it says, Shlach lecha. And Rashi says, God says, if you want to send them, send them. I'm not commanding you. And there are many discussions why Moshe sent. We actually spent a whole class on this. So we're not going to go back over that. But nonetheless, according to Rashi, God gave the decision to Moshe whether to send or not to send. And we discussed many, many ideas of why in the end he did send. But again, this was something that was left for Moshe to decide. And then the last one was just in 2 parshas ago when Moshe hits the rock instead of speaking to it. God commanded him to speak to the rock and bring forth water. And Moshe instead hits the rock. And we also discussed that at great length. So I was just trying to make a picture here, a very, very different picture that we have of Moshe. Because when we think of him as the most humble person, we think of him as just carrying out God's commands. But when we look at the whole life of Moshe, and there are a few other we didn't mention, we see that Moshe actually was a great initiator. He made a lot of decisions on his own, and we see that God allowed him to do that. This is the classic formula that God not only gives us free will, but he wants us to use it. And here we see in the Torah, where you would imagine that with 613 commandments, that there would be very little space for Moshe's free will. But here we see very, very differently that as a Eved Ne'aman, as a faithful servant, part of being a faithful servant is to use our God-given talents and our intellect to sometimes make decisions on our own. And we see, if we would go through all the ones we mentioned of Moshe taking initiative, we'll see that almost all of them turned out very well. But we also see exceptions. We see exceptions where hitting the rock, it ended up Moshe not coming into Eretz Yisrael, or taking the mixed multitude. So we see that, according to Kabbalah, Moshe needs to fix something here. He needs to come back in every generation to rectify that decision that he made. So we see from all of this that to be a faithful servant of God, of course it means doing what God tells us in the Torah. Of course it means that. But it also means that when something is really bothering us, that we have permission to speak to God about it. It's a very, very important lesson. Now, of course, it has to be done with tremendous respect and not out of anger and not out of a sign of not having faith in God and questioning. But don't we all question God sometimes? Does anyone really know everything that's going on in their lives and why it's happening and what's happening in the world, that we wouldn't naturally turn to God and say, Rabboni Shalom, I don't understand. Please explain this to me. Or sometimes even a bit sharper, like Moshe and Abraham and many of the prophets, that when they had questions, they asked them. But again, not out of lack of faith. It was actually their tremendous faith that God is there for me to talk to. God wants me to express myself. So this is a very, very important teaching that we can all take to heart. And especially in a world where there's so much we don't understand. There's so much we don't understand. And on Tisha B'Av, if we look carefully at some of the keynotes, some of the special poetry that we say on Tisha B'Av, along with the Book of Lamentations, some of it is, God, how could you let this happen? How could this be? And it's coming from a deep cry in our hearts. But it's not a cry of unfaithfulness. It's a cry that God should listen to our prayers and should bring goodness to the world and rectification to the world and ultimately Mashiach to the world.